Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your own eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye.
Good morning. For those of you who are at the point of thinking, I cannot take much more of this guy preaching, you got very good news this morning. So we're all excited about the Webbs coming and look forward to getting them here. We live in a culture of rage. Would anybody disagree with that? If you agree with me, stand up. Really, I just want an excuse to have you stand up because you haven't had the chance to do that yet. Go ahead and sit down. We live in a culture of rage. All you have to do is turn on the TV and watch Housewives of Beverly Hills or Atlanta or New Jersey. You see rage every week. You have to watch the news and see Crossfire on CNN. You see rage. You can even turn to ESPN and watch Between the Lines. And they're yelling and screaming and insulting each other. There is rage. And to be more serious, you just have to see what's going on in Ferguson or Baltimore or Chicago, Paris, France, Syria. What you see is rage. The place that I see it most is the comments on the internet. I'll go out and I'll read news stories, and actually I really don't even want to watch the news or read the news story anymore. I just skip to the comments. And it is amazing the vitriol, the hatred, the insults that people will put into their comments on the internet. We live absolutely in a culture of rage. I have lived 60 years. I can remember well every one of the presidential elections since Kennedy and Goldwater in 1964. I remember that one very, very well. And I think you would agree with me, we have never seen one like the one we have been through recently. And it reflects that culture of rage that I was talking about. The personal insults, the name-calling, the accusations, the foul language, the tawdry stories. There's never been anything like it in a presidential election. There's a story told about a baker and a farmer. The farmer bought his butter from the baker, and he started noticing that the butter, the 1 pound things of butter, seemed to be weighing less than they used to. He accused the baker of fraud, and he took him to court. So the judge is taking testimony, and he calls the farmer to the stand and says, "Farmer, how do you manage to weigh the butter that you sell to this baker?" And he says, "Well, I don't have a scale." He says, "Once I started buying my bread from the baker and I realized he was making 1 pound loaves of bread, I decided that I would use his loaves of bread to measure my butter." And at that point, the judge turns to the baker and says, "Well, you only have yourself to blame." And I think in many ways we only have ourselves to blame for what we're seeing in our society and the choices that we have right now. It reflects our culture. Last night, as I told you last week, on Saturday nights, I like to turn on a movie or something to be in the background when I'm finishing up the sermon. And last night's treatise, spiritual treatise, was Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And there's a line in Captain America where he stands up and he says, "I believe that society is at a tipping point. between control and chaos. And I thought, how prophetic. I think our society is really at a tipping point between control and chaos. And we see it reflected in what's happening here. And you wonder, how did we get to that point? How is it that we reached a point where we have that level of hatred and anger and those kind of things being expressed? And I think it's caused by something that's called attribution. Now, attribution in social psychology is the process by which we explain the causes for our behavior. And while it sounds kind of complicated, it's really pretty simple. There's internal attribution, which says that behavior is caused by things that are innate inside of us. Maybe our personality or our mood or our just capabilities that we were born with. That's internal attribution. And then there's external attribution that says that behaviors are caused by what's going on around me, the situation that I'm in, or the people that I'm interacting with. That's causing my behaviors to be the way that they are. So how does this attribution thing work? Well, there's something called actor-observer bias, which tends to be that if we are the observer of a situation, and particularly one that's going poorly, and we are watching someone else do what they do, we say, oh, well, that's because of the kind of person they are, right? That's because of their internal nature that they act that way. But if we are the actor and things aren't going well, we tend to say, oh, well, it was the situation I was put in. It was my boss that caused me to act this way. Or it was the situation that I got put into with that group of people. And it's really not my fault. And it's especially seen in self-serving bias, because self-serving bias says that if I'm successful at something and the situation's going well, I say, oh, well, that was internal. That was because I'm a pretty good guy. I don't know what to tell you. I'm fairly talented. I'm extremely intelligent. I've got a great sense of humor, and so obviously this is going well because of me. But if things are going poorly, then I believe it's due to external situation. And so I tend to view the internal or the external by what serves my interests best. And then the last piece of it is this idea of naive realism. And naive realism is our tendency to believe that we see the world completely objectively. We have the ability to weigh facts exactly as they are. And if someone disagrees with us, the problem is that they are either biased or uninformed or irrational. Now, that's a very convenient belief system to have. If I see the world in a certain way and you disagree with me, the problem is obviously you. Now, the people who lived in my house for all these years know that that's exactly how I see the world. And they've managed to cope with that. So, what does all of this have to do with our world and what we're talking about today? Well, how does attribution manifest itself in our world? Well, it manifests itself in the blame game. Right? So if something is going wrong, there's somebody that has to be blamed. If I didn't get what I wanted, if the outcome didn't happen the way that I wanted it to, someone has to pay. Someone's going to get blamed. There was a story this week in the newspaper about a Mississippi attorney who is suing Popeye's Chicken. He said that he choked when he had to eat a piece of their fried chicken with his hands because they did not include a knife in his drive-thru order. So as the lawsuit lays out, the only utensil that he was given when he went to the Popeyes restaurant, to the drive-thru, was a spork. If you've been to Popeyes or Taco Bell or Kentucky Fried Chicken, you get a spork, right? And so he said that because he didn't receive a plastic knife, his only option was to hold the chicken breast with his hands and to tear off pieces of the meat with his teeth, which caused him to choke. And so he said he underwent emergency surgery to remove the piece of chicken from his throat. So in his lawsuit, he is now saying that along with ensuring that everyone from this point forward gets a knife if they go to a Popeyes, he certainly wants just a little bit of financial compensation and punitive damages, not only from Popeyes, but from the manager of the store, the people who manufacture the sporks and the knives, the people who are in procurement, etc., etc., etc. This is the blame game on steroids. Right? Now, I have to tell you, I was so appalled by this that I went to Popeye's Chicken on Friday night. And I got, just like him, I got 3 sporks with my order, and I got no knives. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to choke and try to get a settlement. But then I realized I couldn't afford the time off from work, so I just kind of ate it, and actually it was pretty good. All right, so the blame game we play just as a matter of course. There's industries that support this. And how does it look? It looks like accusations. It looks like blame. It looks like condemnation. And it looks like demonization. So, this week, there's a report that some people are calling Hillary the Antichrist, and they're calling Trump the next Hitler. That's probably as good a demonization as you can possibly come up with in particular, right? And we go there because if I can put you in a category that people hate, then I no longer have to listen to you. I can put you to the side, and I no longer have to pay attention to anything that you say. Very judgmental. Now, the other way that we see attribution being manifest in our culture is through this idea of the tyranny of tolerance. Right? And tolerance would tell you that all values, all beliefs, all lifestyles, all truth claims are equal. So we should treat all of them the same. We should give them equal weighting and equal respect. And by the way, if you choose to believe that one of them is true and the others of them are false, then you are now, by definition, intolerant. And we no longer have to listen to you because you are an intolerant person. It's part of demonization. So there was a story, again in the news, about a 13-year-old Christian girl at a state high school in Queensland, Australia. And she was confronted with the situation of being forced to either complete an assignment that went against her Christian beliefs or getting an F. Now, the details of it were that not only was she asked to do an assignment that she believed conflicted with her beliefs, but she was asked to withhold it from her parents. All the kids were asked to sign something to say, you will not tell your parents about this. You will do it in school. We will discuss it in school, and no one else will know anything about this. And so the assignment was a discussion about homosexuality. And they were given a scenario that you are in a colony on the moon. You are the only heterosexual in this colony on the moon, and you are living with a group of homosexuals. How are you going to cope? And in this terribly intolerant world that you will now be living in. She said she did not feel like that was an assignment that went along with her beliefs. She was given an F. So when her report card came home, her mother wanted to know why. She said she couldn't tell her. The mother went to the school and found out about the assignment. Not only did the girl continue to receive the F, but she was reprimanded for her mother finding out about it after it was all over. Finally, the mother was told her daughter would be better off somewhere else because of her intolerant attitudes. This is the tyranny of tolerance on steroids. The fact is, there's so much inconsistency in it that a group of people who would call intolerance the worst sin can, by definition, be intolerant of those who do not agree with them or do not believe with them. And so it falls in upon itself the illogic of the tyranny of tolerance. So how does that manifest itself? We see the requirement that you will acquiesce to what society wants. You will acquiesce to the belief system that's in place today. You will be bullied into accepting that belief system. And at the same time, we will then accuse you of bullying because you have taken a stand that we do not agree with in society. We will ask you to compromise your beliefs. And finally, we will hope that they will disappear and will be absorbed in this tolerance for all things having equal weight and equal importance. And so what we see when we have the blame game is this punitive judgment. I have decided that this is reality. I have decided this is the way things should go. And since you do not agree with me, I will demonize you. I will talk about you. I will put you in a box. And I will exert punitive judgment on you. On the other side, tolerance, what we see is the requirement for passive acceptance. Just go along, get along, or get out. Now, I'd like to say that this is really kind of an American 21st century phenomena, but the fact is it is not. And it is one that has been a conflict of authority and perspective for generations, for centuries. You see, the authority in the blame game is me. If I want what I want and you stand in the way of that, I'm going to blame you for my poor outcome, and all I want is what I want. I am the ultimate authority. In the area of tolerance, society is the ultimate authority. Whatever the mores are of society today, and if they shift, you need to shift with them, by the way, then society becomes the ultimate authority. And the results are, on the one hand, very hollow justification of my actions by blaming you for the things that I don't like, or on the other side, a very hurtful hypocrisy, calling you intolerant when I am indeed being intolerant myself. And it was in this world that Jesus walks in Matthew chapter 7. You see, the same things were going on with the Pharisees versus the Sadducees, with the Jews versus the Samaritans, with the Romans versus the Jews. There was blame game for the situation that we're in, and there was a sense of a tyranny of tolerance. You can't believe the stuff that this guy, this supposed Messiah, is coming up with. It doesn't conform to what we believe. And so you will be punished. You will be killed for holding those beliefs. And so in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus, in the first 5 verses that we just read a few minutes ago, Jesus deals with the side of this equation that is about punitive judgment. Don't judge, or you're going to be judged by the exact same standard. And before you start that, remember that that problem you see with the person across from you is probably not nearly as big as the problem that you have yourself. And he uses an example that's absurd. There's a splinter in that person's eye. There's a log in your eye. You better remove the log from your eye before you start talking about the splinter in the other person's eye. And I wonder to what degree, if we just listen to that piece alone of Matthew chapter 7, how different our discourse would be in our society today. Before I start launching scuds at those who would think differently than I do, perhaps I should think about the language I'm using, the attitude I'm approaching it with, and the blame game that I'm playing on my side of the equation at the same time. It's interesting because it wasn't just Jesus who said this about judging. The Apostle Paul, when he came along 20 years later, said exactly the same thing in Romans chapter 2. You're without excuse, whoever you are, when you judge someone else. For whatever grounds you judge another, you condemn yourself, because you who judge practice the same things. You know, my mother used to tell me that anytime you point a finger at someone, there are 4 pointing back at you. And that's what Paul's talking about. That's what Jesus is talking about. So, hey, we're done. Just don't judge and everything will be okay. But wait a minute. There's another side of the equation. This idea that you should just go along, get along. So don't judge anybody. Just go along with the way things are and we'll have peace. But it's interesting that Jesus and his apostles talk about that as well. In fact, it's only one verse past what we read this morning that Jesus implies that there is a time and a place for judgment. And in fact, in verse 6, what he says is, don't give dogs what is sacred. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces. Well, somebody has to decide who are the dogs and who are the pigs. There's some judgment implied inside of that. In John chapter 7, Jesus is talking in a different place and says, don't judge according to external appearances, but judge with a proper judgment. So how do we reconcile that? On the one hand, don't judge because you're going to get judged by the same measure you judge people. And on the other hand, well, don't judge according to external appearances. And by the way, don't give your good stuff to dogs and pigs. Right? Now that language would fit very well with what we've been hearing in the news the last 6-8 months. All right? So how do we reconcile all of that? Well, in Galatians chapter 6, we see a little bit of a diagnostic in how we start to reconcile this. Paul, writing to the Galatians, says, brothers and sisters, if a person is discovered in some sin, you who are spiritual, restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness. Pay close attention to yourselves so that you're not tempted to. Carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. Let each one examine his own work. So, how does this passage tell us to handle this idea of punitive judgment? Well, first of all, we need to be self-aware. The first thing it says is, watch yourself, pay close attention to yourself, examine your own work. Don't jump off and do something without taking a look in the mirror and seeing what's really there first. And be accountable. Examining your own work means you are accountable for your actions. It is not someone else's fault for who you are, or how you are reacting, or what choices you have made. You are accountable for those choices. You are accountable for your behavior. And you are accountable for how you interact with those who may be doing something wrong. Be accountable. And then last of all, use the right standard. He says, carry out one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. You see, the standard is not me. The standard is not society. The highest authority is the law of God. So when you make judgment according to the right standard. And so, rather than having punitive judgment, what we then see is that the judgment should be internal. I should judge myself and then decide how I am going to interact with those who might be doing something that is in error or wrong or that I don't like. Now, what about the other side of the equation? I hope I can read that. Galatians chapter 6 still. The first thing he says is, you do need to confront those who are doing something wrong, but do it with a spirit of gentleness. This idea of carefrontation, not confrontation. We must address wrong when we see it. Our job is not to assimilate into a culture that accepts anything, believes anything, and says that all truth is relevant. Because we believe there is absolute truth. But how we go about asserting that should be done in the spirit of care, concern, love, and gentleness. And then be balanced. When we are pointing that one finger out, remember the four that are pointing back. Examine ourselves in light of the message and the method we're using in dealing with what we see around us. And then this idea of beware. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul says, beware of the dogs. Here we're dogs again. Beware of the evil workers. Beware of those who mutilate the flesh. See, it's easy to say we should just love everyone. I mean, doesn't the Bible call us to love? We should just love everyone. But what Paul says is there are people out there who are evil. There is such a thing as evil in the world. There are people who are willing to walk into a room of innocent people and blow themselves up and blow all of those people up as well. There is evil in the world. And you need to beware of evil. There are people who have bad motives. They don't just make a mistake. They have bad motives. They want bad things to occur in order to get what they want. Beware of those people. And so, 1 Thessalonians takes it a step forward. Examine all things. Hold fast to what is good. There is good. There is evil. We are called to be discerning. There is a difference in being judgmental and being discerning. Discerning says recognize evil, address it, get away from it, stay pure. Judgmentalism says, I'm going to accuse you of all of these bad things in the world in order to gain something for myself and to make myself feel better. We are not called to just be tolerant of people in the current sense of tolerance. We are called to be discerning. And so the last verse, dear friends, don't believe every spirit, but test the spirits to determine if they're from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. And I'm fairly certain that maybe one or both of our presidential candidates are false prophets because they've been accused of it in every publication you can possibly imagine up to this point in time. So somebody's got to be right that at least one of them, and maybe both, fall into that category. But see, we're called on Tuesday as Americans to be discerning. We're not called to be vitriolic. We're not called to be hateful. We are called to be discerning. And we need to make the choice that we make, and we need to do it in a spirit of Christianity. However you choose to vote as an American citizen on Tuesday should have nothing to do with the unity that we have as brothers and sisters in Christ. The authority of God outweighs any authority, any dilemmas that we have in this world. As a citizen of this country, and by the way, Romans 13, Paul says, whoever gets picked, God picked them. Now, 50% of us in this room are probably not going to like the outcome, the way that the polls would tell us. Regardless of who wins, 50%. Actually, at this point, probably 70% of us aren't going to be happy who wins, even if we vote for one of them, right? I saw something this week where somebody said, it was an undecided voter, and he said, yeah, I'm just trying to decide who I hate the least. Now, there's a great way to go into an election, but that's where we are. But regardless of the outcome on Tuesday, we are still citizens of a bigger kingdom. We are citizens of a heavenly, eternal kingdom. And whatever this outcome is, cannot and should not divide us. And it only will if we yield to judgmentalism as opposed to discernment. Now, the last thing that comes up is the way that we should be handling this idea of discernment is that we're called to be bold. Hebrews chapter 10. My righteous one will live by faith. I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. Our job as citizens of this country that we live in today, our job as citizens of the kingdom of God, is to be bold in our beliefs, in our lifestyle, in what we have been called to be as children of God. And to not shrink back under the pressure of a blame game, to not shrink back under the pressure of a tyranny of tolerance, to not shrink back in fear or cynicism or disgust, but to move boldly forward as the people of God. And regardless of what happens Tuesday night on Wednesday morning, we are still called to that call. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there was no person in all of East Germany who was more despised than the former dictator of East Germany, communist Erich Honecker. He had been stripped of all of his offices, and even at that point, the Communist Party rejected him for being a failure. He was kicked out of his villa. The new government refused him and his wife new housing. They were basically homeless and destitute. So enter a pastor by the name of Uwe Holmer. He was the director of a Christian help center that was north of Berlin. He was made aware of the Honeckers' situation, and he felt like it would be wrong to give them a room that was meant for people who were much needier than the Honeckers were. So he and his family decided to take the former dictator into their own home. Now, his wife, Erich Honecker's wife, Margot, had also been an official in East Germany. She had actually ruled the East German educational system for about 26 years. And 8 of Pastor Holmer's 10 children had been turned down for higher education due to her policies, which discriminated against Christians. So now, ironically, here are the Holmers bringing in the Honeckers into their own home, caring for their own personal enemy, the most hated man in Germany. It was very unnatural, it was very unconventional, but it was very Christ-like. And by the grace of God, the Holmers loved their enemies. They fed them, they kept them warm, they blessed them, they prayed for them, they turned the other cheek, and they literally gave their enemies their own coats when wintertime came. They did for them what they wished that the Honeckers had done for the 26 years preceding for them. Now, it would be a wonderful story if I told you that the Honeckers decided that they wanted to become Christians. They surrendered their life to Christ, were changed by all of this. The fact is, there's no evidence to suggest that that ever occurred. But see, that's not the point of the story. The result of what happens isn't what's important. It's the decisions we make when we're faced with people who believe in things that we would never believe in, who are faced with actions that we would never condone. And yet, we are called to serve. We are called to minister. We are called to be bigger than the conflicts that are around us. In one way or the other, we are all going to be called to that on Wednesday morning of this week. However you decide to participate in the process on Tuesday, I pray that you will pray for wisdom, for discernment, and for God to bless a nation that is tipping between control and chaos right now, and that He would bring us back. And regardless if this leader is going to be one of the good leaders or one of the bad leaders going forward, He calls us to still be Christ-like in the midst of all of that, to reach across the aisle, to reach across to those who might be hateful, who might be vitriolic, and who might be waiting to see how are these so-called Christians truly going to handle themselves now. That's our challenge. That's our call. The message is yours. Let's stand and sing.